My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I'm about to tell you, and why I'm still breathing to tell it. For 15 years, I walked the main line in some of California's hardest yards, Pelican Bay, Corcoran, Tehachapi, places where a wrong look gets you a knife between the ribs, where respect is currency and weakness is a death sentence. Everyone knew Rick Stevens. Hell, even the guards whispered his name with a mix of fear and twisted respect. 6'4", arms like tree trunks, covered in ink that told the story of 2 decades behind bars. The yard went quiet when Rick walked by. Inmates stepped aside, eyes down, knowing that this man could greenlight anyone with a nod. But I'm here to tell you something that'll shake everything you think you know about power in the system. Rick Stevens, the man they called the shot caller of Southern California's prisons, was nothing but smoke and mirrors. A carefully crafted illusion designed to keep the real power hidden in the shadows. I should know. I was part of the machine that created him. It started in 2007 at Corcoran State Prison. I just transferred in from Lancaster, carrying my own reputation as a solid Peckerwood with connections on the streets. The AB, Aryan Brotherhood, had their hooks in me since I was 18, fresh-faced and stupid in county lockup. By the time I hit the big yards, I understood the politics, the unwritten rules, the delicate balance that kept our world from exploding into chaos. Rick was already there when I arrived, but he wasn't the mythical figure he'd become. He was just another lifer with anger issues and a talent for violence. What made him special wasn't his criminal mind or his strategic thinking. It was his willingness to be seen. The real shot callers, the council as we called them internally, had learned something the hard way. The more visible you are, the more target you become. Not just from rivals, but from the feds, from prison intelligence, from anyone looking to make a name by taking down a big fish. So they developed what they called the proxy system. Rick Stevens was the perfect proxy. I remember the first time I saw the system in action. It was during a yard dispute between the Mexicans and some bulldogs over commissary territory. Tensions were high, the kind of high that ends in lockdowns and body bags. Everyone expected Rick to make the call, to either escalate or de-escalate. Rick did what he always did. He looked tough, said the right words, and gave the order that everyone heard. But what they didn't see was the note that had been passed to him 20 minutes earlier, written in a code so simple it was brilliant. What looked like a commissary list was actually detailed instructions on exactly what to say and do. The real decision had been made by 3 men who never spoke Rick's name, never acknowledged his existence, and certainly never met with him directly. They communicated through a network of intermediaries so complex it would make the CIA jealous. A word whispered to a trustee, a book left in a specific cell, a particular exercise routine performed in the yard. I became part of that network by accident. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. With the council, you could never tell. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I'm about to tell you, and why I'm still breathing to tell it. For 15 years, I walked the main line in some of California's hardest yards, Pelican Bay, Corcoran, Tehachapi, places where a wrong look gets you a knife between the ribs, where respect is currency and weakness is a death sentence. Everyone knew Rick Stevens. Hell, even the guards whispered his name with a mix of fear and twisted respect. 6'4", arms like tree trunks, covered in ink that told the story of 2 decades behind bars. The yard went quiet when Rick walked by. Inmates stepped aside, eyes down, knowing that this man could green-light anyone with a nod. But I'm here to tell you something that'll shake everything you think you know about power in the system. Rick Stevens, the man they called the shot caller of Southern California's prisons, was nothing but smoke and mirrors, a carefully crafted illusion designed to keep the real power hidden in the shadows. I should know. I was part of the machine that created him. It started in 2007 at Corcoran State Prison. I'd just transferred in from Lancaster, carrying my own reputation as a solid Peckerwood with connections on the streets. The AB, Aryan Brotherhood, had their hooks in me since I was 18, fresh-faced and stupid in county lockup. By the time I hit the big yards, I understood the politics, the unwritten rules, the delicate balance that kept our world from exploding into chaos. Rick was already there when I arrived, but he wasn't the mythical figure he'd become. He was just another lifer with anger issues and a talent for violence. What made him special wasn't his criminal mind or his strategic thinking. It was his willingness to be seen. The real shot callers, the council as we called them internally, had learned something the hard way. The more visible you are, the more target you become. Not just from rivals, but from the feds, from prison intelligence, from anyone looking to make a name by taking down a big fish. So they developed what they called the proxy system. Rick Stevens was the perfect proxy. I remember the first time I saw the system in action. It was during a yard dispute between the Mexicans and some bulldogs over commissary territory. Tensions were high, the kind of high that ends in lockdowns and body bags. Everyone expected Rick to make the call, to either escalate or de-escalate. Rick did what he always did. He looked tough, said the right words, and gave the order that everyone heard. But what they didn't see was the note that had been passed to him 20 minutes earlier, written in a code so simple it was brilliant. What looked like a commissary list was actually detailed instructions on exactly what to say and do. The real decision had been made by 3 men who never spoke Rick's name, never acknowledged his existence, and certainly never met with him directly. They communicated through a network of intermediaries so complex it would make the CIA jealous. A word whispered to a trustee, a book left in a specific cell, a particular exercise routine performed in the yard. I became part of that network by accident. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. With the council, you could never tell. 3 months into my stay at Corcoran, I got my first taste of how deep the rabbit hole went. It started with something as simple as a chess game. Marcus "Tank" Williams was a lifer from Oakland, built like a brick shithouse and smart as hell. Everyone knew Tank was connected, but no one could figure out exactly how. He wasn't flashy like Rick, didn't make speeches or throw his weight around. Tank just played chess in the day room, quietly, destroying anyone who sat across from him. One Tuesday afternoon, Tank asked if I wanted a game. I'd been watching him play for weeks, studying his style, thinking I had him figured out. I was wrong about everything. "You see how Rick handled that thing with the Bulldogs yesterday?" Tank asked as he moved his queen into position. I nodded, remembering the tense confrontation that had everyone on edge. Rick had stepped in, said a few words, and somehow diffused a situation that should have ended in blood. "Smart move," I replied, not really thinking about it. Tank smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel good. "Rick's got good instincts," he said. "Always knows exactly what to say, when to say it." There was something in his tone that made me look up from the board. Tank was studying me with those cold, calculating eyes. "You ever wonder how someone gets that smart overnight?" he continued. "Rick wasn't always the sharpest tool in the shed. 2 years ago, he couldn't organize a commissary run without fucking it up. Now he's making calls that keep this whole yard from burning down." That's when it hit me. Tank wasn't just making conversation. He was recruiting me. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I'd missed before. How certain inmates would appear in specific areas of the yard at precise times. How conversations would stop and start based on subtle hand signals. How information flowed through the prison like water finding the path of least resistance. The council wasn't just 3 men making decisions. It was an entire ecosystem of intelligence gathering, communication, and enforcement that had taken years to perfect. And Rick Stevens, for all his fearsome reputation, was just the public face of something much more sophisticated. My official initiation came during what the guards called the commissary wars. Tensions between different factions over canteen privileges had been building for months. Everyone expected Rick to handle it, to lay down the law and restore order. But behind the scenes, the real work was being done by people you'd never suspect. Tank approached me with what seemed like a simple request. He needed someone to deliver a message to a Mexican national named Vasquez. Nothing dramatic, just a folded piece of paper that looked like a kite, prison slang for an illegal note. What I didn't realize until later was that I was being tested. The message was actually a carefully crafted piece of disinformation, designed to see if I could be trusted with real intelligence. If I'd opened it, or shown it to anyone else, or failed to deliver it exactly as instructed, I would have been marked as unreliable. I passed the test. The next day, Rick Stevens made a dramatic announcement in the day room. He was implementing new rules for commissary access, effective immediately. His voice carried that familiar authority, that sense of absolute command that made everyone listen. But I knew the truth now. Rick was reading from a script that had been written by minds far more strategic than his own. That night, Tank explained how it really worked. "Rick's got balls. I'll give him that," he said as we walked the tier. "Takes guts to stand in front of 200 convicts and lay down the law. But balls without brains just gets you killed faster." He was right. The commissary rules that Rick announced weren't just about canteen privileges. They were a complex piece of social engineering designed to reduce tensions, create new revenue streams, and strengthen the council's invisible control over the yard. Every detail had been calculated, every possible reaction anticipated. "The beauty of the proxy system," Tank explained, "is that everyone focuses on the puppet while the puppeteers stay invisible. Rick takes the credit when things go right, and he takes the heat when they go wrong. Meanwhile, the real decision-makers stay in the shadows, safe from retaliation, safe from the feds, safe from anyone who might want to challenge their authority." I was starting to understand my role in this machine. I wasn't just a messenger or a foot soldier. I was part of the network that kept the illusion alive, that made Rick Stevens seem like the most powerful man in California's prison system while the real power remained hidden in plain sight. But with understanding came danger. Because once you know how the machine really works, you become both valuable and vulnerable. The council needed people like me to function, but they also needed to ensure our absolute loyalty. That lesson came sooner than I expected. 6 months deep into my role as a cog in the council's machine, I learned why so few people ever talked about what really went on behind the scenes. It wasn't just loyalty or fear. It was survival. The lesson came through a guy named Danny "Rook" Castellanos. Rook had been around longer than most, a veterano who'd seen the prison system evolve from the old days when shot callers were exactly what they appeared to be. He'd watched the council's proxy system develop, had even helped design some of its more sophisticated elements. But Rook made a mistake. He started to believe his own importance. It happened during a classified meeting, one of those gatherings that officially didn't exist, held in the blind spot of the B-yard cameras. 5 of us huddled around a concrete table, discussing what looked like ordinary prison business, but was actually high-level strategic planning. The topic was expansion. The council had perfected their system at Corcoran, and now they wanted to export it to other yards. Pelican Bay, San Quentin, even some federal facilities. The plan was ambitious, requiring dozens of reliable operators and perfect coordination across multiple institutions. Rook saw an opportunity. Maybe he thought his years of service had earned him a seat at the real table. Maybe he was just tired of being invisible. Whatever his reasoning, he made a fatal error. He started making suggestions that went beyond his authority. "We need to bring Rick into the loop," he said during one particularly sensitive discussion. "This gets big enough. He's going to start asking questions. Better to control the narrative from the start." The table went quiet. Tank's expression didn't change, but I caught the micro-signals that meant danger. A slight adjustment of his posture, a particular way of looking at his hands. "Rick's role is clearly defined," Tank replied calmly. "No need to complicate things." But Rook pressed on. "I'm just saying, the man's not stupid. He's gonna figure out—" "Drop it." The voice belonged to someone I'd never heard speak before. A thin, pale man everyone called Ghost. In 6 months of meetings, I'd heard Ghost say maybe 20 words total. When he spoke, It was like the air itself got heavier. Rook should have listened. Instead, he made his second mistake. "With respect," he said, "I think I've earned the right to voice concerns about operational security." What happened next didn't look like violence. There was no shouting, no sudden movements, no dramatic confrontation. Tank simply nodded to Ghost, who made a note on a piece of paper. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened. 2 days later, Rook was found hanging in his cell. Officially, it was suicide, a troubled lifer who couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The guards filed their reports, the administration held their inquiry, and everyone moved on. But those of us in the network knew better. Rook's death wasn't just punishment for stepping out of line. It was a message, carefully crafted and precisely delivered. The Council's power wasn't just organizational, it was absolute. That's when I fully understood what I'd gotten myself into. This wasn't just about prison politics or criminal enterprise. This was about something far more dangerous, a shadow government that operated with complete impunity, using Rick Stevens and others like him as public faces while the real power remained untouchable. The genius of their system became clearer every day. Rick continued to make his dramatic pronouncements, to settle disputes and issue orders with theatrical authority. But every word he spoke, every decision he made, every gesture of power was choreographed by minds he'd never meet. Meanwhile, the Council expanded their network. New operators were recruited through the same careful process I'd experienced. Messages flowed through increasingly. Complex channels. The proxy system spread to other yards exactly as planned, with local Rick Stevens figures established to draw attention away from the real shot callers. And through it all, the investigators, the gang intelligence officers, the federal prosecutors, they all focused on the puppets while the puppeteers remained invisible. I started keeping my own mental records, not because I planned to do anything with the information, but because forgetting details could be fatal. Every meeting, every code word, every subtle signal, it all went into my memory bank. Insurance against the day when my usefulness might be questioned, because I'd learned something that Rook never figured out. In the Council's world, there were only two kinds of people, those who were useful enough to keep alive and those who weren't. The trick was making sure you stayed in the first category without ever appearing to threaten your way into the second. But as months turned into years, as I watched the proxy system evolve and expand, I began to understand something that would eventually change everything. The Council's greatest strength, their invisibility, was also potentially their greatest weakness. Because if someone could expose the truth, if they could pull back the curtain and reveal the real power structure, the entire system would collapse like a house of cards. The question was whether anyone would be brave enough, or crazy enough, to try. Chapter 4. Breaking the Silence. 10 years. That's how long I played my part in the most sophisticated power structure I've ever seen. 10 years of watching Rick Stevens take credit and blame for decisions made by ghosts. 10 years of carrying messages, maintaining codes, and keeping secrets that could topple kingdoms. The end came, like most endings do, from an unexpected direction. It started with a new fish named Kevin Torres, a young kid from Fresno who'd made the mistake of trying to muscle in on Council territory on the outside. He came into Corcoran with a reputation for being smart and ruthless, exactly the kind of recruit the network usually absorbed and redirected. But Kevin had something most recruits didn't, a federal investigation following him like a shadow. The FBI had been tracking Kevin's street operations for 2 years, building a RICO case that was supposed to roll up an entire criminal network. When Kevin got sent to Corcoran, the feds didn't just walk away. They planted listening devices, recruited informants, and started mapping the prison's power structure with the kind of resources usually reserved for international terrorism. At first, the investigation focused exactly where everyone expected, on Rick Stevens. Agents spent months documenting Rick's movements, recording his conversations, analyzing his apparent decision-making process. They built charts and graphs showing Rick at the center of a criminal enterprise, exactly the kind of kingpin narrative that plays well in federal court. But the deeper they dug, the more confused they became. Rick's communications didn't match the sophistication of the organization they were observing. His financial resources were limited. Most damning of all, his behavior patterns showed someone who was being directed rather than directing. That's when they started looking for the real power. The investigation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Federal resources, state cooperation, intelligence-level surveillance, focused on a single prison yard. They tracked every conversation, mapped every relationship, analyzed patterns of behavior that the council thought were invisible. Slowly, methodically, they began to identify the true network. Tank was the first to sense the heat. His decades of survival had given him instincts that bordered on supernatural. He started modifying communication protocols, changing meeting locations, altering the subtle signals that kept the network functioning. But it was too late. The feds had already identified the key nodes in the system. They knew about Ghost, about the other council members, about the complex web of intermediaries and operators that made the proxy system possible. The indictments came down on a Tuesday morning in March. Not for Rick Stevens. He was named as a co-conspirator, but the real targets were the invisible men who'd been pulling his strings for years. Tank, Ghost, and 7 others were charged under RICO statutes with running a continuing criminal enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming. Recorded conversations, financial records, witness testimony from operators who'd been flipped during the investigation. But here's the thing about shadows. When you shine enough light on them, they disappear. With the real power structure exposed, the proxy system collapsed overnight. Rick Stevens, stripped of his invisible support network, was revealed as what he'd always been. A violent man with limited intelligence who'd been following orders he barely understood. The other proxy shot callers across the system found themselves in the same position, suddenly responsible for maintaining control without the sophisticated guidance they'd unknowingly relied upon. Some yards erupted in violence as power vacuums created chaos. Others simply reorganized under new leadership, returning to older, more visible forms of prison politics. But the damage to the council's revolutionary approach was irreversible. The proxy system, perfected over more than a decade, had been exposed and dismantled in a matter of months. I was lucky. My role as a mid-level operator kept me below the federal radar, and my cooperation with investigators earned me protection rather than prosecution. But surviving the collapse came with its own price. I had to leave everything behind, except transfer to protective custody, and live with the knowledge that I'd helped destroy something that, for all its brutality, had been genuinely extraordinary. Now, years later, living free but forever changed, I'm telling this story because the truth matters. Rick Stevens was never the shot caller everyone believed he was. The real power in Southern California's prison system belonged to men whose names you'll never know, whose faces you'd never recognize, whose genius lay in remaining invisible while controlling everything. They created a system so sophisticated that even experienced investigators were fooled for years. They managed to maintain order, generate revenue, and exercise absolute authority while staying completely off the radar. And if it hadn't been for one federal investigation with unlimited resources and a stroke of investigative brilliance, they might still be running things today. The proxy system is gone, but its lessons remain. In any power structure, the most dangerous person isn't the one standing in front making speeches. It's the one in the shadows, pulling strings you can't even see. Rick Stevens was notorious, feared, and ultimately irrelevant. The real shot callers were the ones you never heard of. Until now. Chapter 5. The Phoenix Protocol. But the story doesn't end with federal indictments and collapsed networks, because men like Tank and Ghost didn't build their empire by accepting defeat. Even from their maximum security cells in ADX Florence, they were already planning their resurrection. I should have stayed quiet. Should have kept my head down and lived out my days in witness protection. Instead, 3 years after the trials ended, I made the mistake of thinking I was safe. The first sign came through my parole officer, a routine check-in that felt anything but routine. Agent Patricia Morales had been handling my case since my release, a straight shooter who understood the complexities of my situation. But that Tuesday morning, she seemed different, nervous. "We've got chatter," she said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. "Nothing specific, but your name's come up in some intercepted communications." The folder contained transcripts from prison phone calls, carefully coded conversations that the FBI's cryptanalysis unit had partially deciphered. What they revealed made my blood run cold. The council wasn't finished. While Tank rotted in solitary confinement and ghost-faced life without parole, their network had evolved. New players had emerged, younger and more tech-savvy than their predecessors. They called it the Phoenix Protocol, a complete reinvention of the proxy system designed to be investigation-proof. "They blame you," Morales continued, "not just for cooperating with the investigation, but for something deeper. They think you understood their system well enough to have prevented its collapse, that you chose not to." She wasn't wrong. In those final months before the indictments came down, I'd seen the signs that others missed. The federal surveillance was becoming too sophisticated, too focused. A word to the right person could have triggered a shutdown of operations, a temporary hibernation that might have saved the network. But I'd stayed silent, watching the investigation close in, part of me hoping that the whole system would finally burn to the ground. Now that choice was coming back to haunt me. The new generation didn't operate like Tank's crew. Where the council had relied on prison-tested veterans and face-to-face communications, the Phoenix network used technology and youth, encrypted apps, cryptocurrency transactions, coded messages hidden in online gaming platforms. They'd studied the old system's weaknesses and designed something far more insidious. Instead of one Rick Stevens, they created dozens, street-level operators across multiple states, each believing they were independent players, none aware they were part of a larger design. The proxy system had gone digital, distributed across platforms and jurisdictions in ways that made traditional investigation nearly impossible. But they still needed the old knowledge, the institutional memory of how prison power really worked. That's where I came in. The approach was subtle at first. A former cellmate reaching out through social media just wanting to catch up. An unexpected visitor at the halfway house where I'd been staying. Someone claiming to be a documentary filmmaker interested in my story. I might have missed the pattern if not for my years in the network. But once you've learned to see the invisible threads of manipulation, you can't unsee them. Every contact, every seemingly innocent interaction was part of a recruitment effort designed to bring me back into the fold. The direct approach came from someone I never expected, Maria Santos, Tank's daughter. I'd never met Maria during my time inside, but Tank had talked about her constantly. His pride and joy, a college graduate who'd stayed clean despite her father's reputation. The kind of daughter who visited every month, put money on commissary, accounts, and believed her father's stories about being wrongfully convicted. Maria found me at a coffee shop in Riverside, looking nothing like the innocent college girl from Tank's photographs. Prison had aged her father, but freedom had hardened his daughter. Her eyes carried the cold calculation I remembered from the network's most dangerous operators. "My father says you were the smartest man he ever worked with," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "Also says you're the reason he's dying in a concrete box." I kept my expression neutral, aware that this conversation was probably being recorded. "Your father made his own choices." "Did he?" Maria's smile was razor thin. "Because the way I hear it, you had information that could have saved the entire network. You chose to let it burn." She wasn't wrong, but admitting it would have been suicide. Instead, I tried to redirect. The system was finished either way. The feds had too many sources. Tank knew that. Tank knew a lot of things, Maria replied, including how to adapt, how to evolve, how to build something better from the ashes. That's when she laid out the Phoenix Protocol in detail. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Instead of concentrating power in a few invisible hands, they'd distributed it across hundreds of operators who didn't even know they were connected. Instead of relying on prison communication networks, they'd moved operations to the dark web and encrypted channels. Most ingeniously, they'd eliminated the proxy system entirely. Every operator was a real decision-maker for their small piece of the network. No one person had enough knowledge to bring down the whole structure, no matter how thoroughly they were investigated. "We need architects," Maria continued. "People who understand how the old system worked, who can help us avoid its mistakes. The compensation would be substantial." The offer was tempting. I won't lie. Witness protection was boring, limiting, and poorly funded. The promise of real money, real power, real purpose. It touched something I'd thought I'd left behind in those prison yards. But I'd learned something in my years with the council that Maria's generation hadn't. Invisibility was intoxicating, but it was also corrosive. The moment you started believing you were untouchable, you'd already lost. "I'm retired," I told her, standing to leave. Maria's expression didn't change, but her words carried unmistakable menace. "Retirement is a luxury, not a right. Think about it." That night, I called Agent Morales. Not because I was scared. Fear had been my constant companion for too long to surprise me anymore. But because I understood what Maria hadn't. The Phoenix Protocol's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. By eliminating central authority, they'd made the network investigation-proof, but they'd also made it impossible to control. Hundreds of independent operators, each making decisions based on incomplete information, each pursuing their own interests within loose guidelines. It was a recipe for chaos, not order. "They want you back in," Morales said after I'd briefed her on the meeting. "They want my knowledge," I corrected. "There's a difference." What I didn't tell Morales was that I'd already made my decision. Not to join the Phoenix Protocol, but to do something far more dangerous. To help destroy it before it could fully emerge. Because I'd seen what happened when sophisticated criminals convinced themselves they were smarter than the system. I'd watched the Council's proxy network collapse not because of bad luck or betrayal, but because they'd forgotten the fundamental truth about power. The moment you think you've perfected it, you've already started losing it. The Phoenix Protocol would burn, just like its predecessor. The only question was how many people would get consumed in the flames, and whether I'd be one of them.